Evelyn Carter sat in the back seat of her black sedan, watching the city blur past the tinted windows. The streets of downtown bustled with workers rushing to offices, some hers, some not, each person lost in their own struggles. She had built Novatech from the ground up, but something had shifted. Reports of low morale, whispered complaints of harsh policies, and an alarming increase in turnover had reached her ears. Yet, whenever she confronted her senior management, she received the same polished responses. Everything is under control. She didn't believe them. She tapped her fingers against the smooth leather seat, eyes narrowing. If she wanted the truth, she'd have to find it herself. 3 days later, Evelyn Carter ceased to exist. In her place stood Eva Collins, an unassuming entry-level employee with an outdated phone, cheap department store flats, and an HR-approved neutral-colored blouse. Her designer wardrobe was replaced with off-the-rack basics. Her sleek bob was now a ponytail with uneven layers. Glasses perched on her nose, not for prescription, but to shift the way people saw her. She took the bus for the first time in years, squashed between exhausted commuters, the scent of strong coffee and city grit clinging to the air. The moment she stepped off at the Novatech offices, her own headquarters, she felt the shift. No longer the commanding presence that made executives scramble to impress. She was invisible. The entrance lobby was as sleek as she remembered, a towering display of glass and steel. But the employees moving through it told a different story. Tired eyes, hurried steps, the tension of people who had learned to expect too much from themselves for too little in return. At the front desk, the receptionist barely looked up. Name: Eva Collins. First day in customer service, she replied, adjusting the strap of a worn canvas bag she'd bought for the role. A visitor's badge was slapped onto the counter. HR's down the hall. The detachment in the woman's tone was telling. This wasn't just a single employee having a bad day. This was a culture. Evelyn weaved through the office, taking in everything. The flickering light above a row of desks that had clearly been ignored, the clatter of keyboards, the occasional sigh of frustration. The open floor plan was supposed to foster collaboration, but the atmosphere was suffocating. She was assigned a cubicle at the far end of the floor, wedged between stacks of outdated paperwork. As she settled into the uncomfortable plastic chair, a weary voice cut through the background noise. You must be new. Evelyn turned. A young woman stood beside her cubicle, one hand resting on the low partition. She was in her mid-20s, with dark circles under her eyes and a belly that, despite the loose sweater she wore, clearly carried the weight of pregnancy. Eva, Evelyn introduced herself, extending a hand. Maria. Welcome to the trenches. Maria's smile was small but genuine. You'll get used to it, or you'll quit. Evelyn arched a brow. That bad? Maria glanced around before leaning in slightly. They expect too much and pay too little. The supervisors, she hesitated. Well, you'll see. Before Evelyn could ask more, a sharp voice snapped through the office. Alvarez. Break's over. Get back to your station. Maria flinched, her expression carefully neutral as she turned toward the speaker. A middle-aged man in an ill-fitting suit, his name badge reading Keith Reynolds, supervisor, stood with arms crossed, eyes narrowed in disapproval. Yes, sir, Maria said quietly, retreating to her desk without another word. Evelyn watched as Keith lingered for a moment, then moved on. Something about the way Maria's shoulders tensed, the way she swallowed hard before refocusing on her screen, sent a ripple of anger through her. Over the next few hours, Evelyn worked through her assigned tasks, but her attention kept drifting toward Maria. The young woman barely took a break, her fingers flying across the keyboard. A deep yawn caught her off guard, and she quickly stifled it, glancing around as if afraid someone might notice. At lunch, Evelyn spotted Maria in the break room, sitting alone with a small container of rice and vegetables. It was a modest meal, and Maria ate slowly, as if making it last. Evelyn sat across from her. Mind if I join you? Maria looked surprised but nodded. Go ahead. They ate in silence for a moment before Evelyn asked, How long have you been here? 2 years. Maria poked at her food with her fork. I used to like it. Good people, steady job. But things changed after the new policies. Evelyn frowned. What policies? Maria hesitated, then lowered her voice. Cut hours, no overtime, but the workload stayed the same. And if you push back, well, she shrugged. People start disappearing. Evelyn knew what that meant. Employees were being quietly forced out. Maria took a sip from a dented water bottle. I tried asking for accommodations. Just small things. A chair at my station, a few extra minutes for breaks. But Keith says I'm using my pregnancy as an excuse. Evelyn's grip on her fork tightened. And HR. Maria let out a soft, humorless laugh. HR works for them, not us. The frustration in Maria's voice was subtle, but it cut through Evelyn like a blade. This was her company. This was happening under her watch. Before Evelyn could respond, the break room door swung open. Keith stood in the doorway, arms crossed. Alvarez, lunch ended 3 minutes ago. Maria's breath hitched. No excuses. Keith's gaze flicked to Evelyn. And you, get back to your desk. Evelyn met his eyes, holding his stare a fraction longer than necessary. A flicker of irritation crossed his face before he turned and walked away. Maria sighed, standing. You should be careful. He doesn't like when people talk too much. Evelyn nodded, but said nothing. She didn't need to. She already knew exactly what she was going to do. Evelyn spent her first week at Novatech navigating the unspoken rules of survival. Keep your head down. Work fast. Don't question authority. The employees were efficient but drained, their enthusiasm long since replaced by quiet resignation. Even those who tried to smile, like Maria, carried the weight of exhaustion in their eyes. Maria's situation gnawed at Evelyn's conscience. She was in her 3rd trimester, yet no accommodations had been made for her. She worked at a standing desk with no chair, took only the shortest breaks, and never complained when Keith assigned her extra tasks. It wasn't just mistreatment, it was a deliberate effort to push her past her limits. Evelyn watched as Maria shifted uncomfortably on her feet during long hours at her station. She winced occasionally, pressing a hand to her lower back, but never asked for relief. The unspoken threat hung in the air. Any sign of weakness would be punished. During a quiet afternoon, Evelyn leaned over. You should sit for a bit. Maria shook her head, typing without pause. Can't. Keith isn't even here. Doesn't matter, Maria murmured, her fingers trembling slightly over the keyboard. He has people watching. The answer sent a cold pulse through Evelyn. She had suspected, but now she knew. Keith's control over his employees extended beyond direct confrontation. He had cultivated an environment of fear, ensuring that even when he wasn't present, his influence was. By the end of the shift, Maria's breathing was uneven, and her movements sluggish. When she finally logged off, she clutched the edge of her desk for a moment, steadying herself. Evelyn didn't miss the way her hands trembled. Outside the building, Evelyn caught up to her. Let me walk you home. Maria hesitated, then gave a tired smile. You don't have to do that. I want to. They walked in silence through the dimly lit streets, past bustling cafes and closed storefronts. Maria's apartment was in an aging complex on the outskirts of the city, the paint peeling, the stairwell light flickering. Inside, the space was modest but tidy. A small couch, a coffee table stacked with overdue bills. Framed photos of a younger boy and an older woman sat on the shelf. My brother Luis, Maria said, noticing Evelyn's gaze. He's 14. And my mother, she hesitated. She had a stroke last year. I take care of them both. Evelyn exhaled slowly. Maria wasn't just fighting for herself. She was holding up an entire household. Have you talked to HR about your situation? Evelyn asked gently. Maria's laughter was soft but bitter. I did. I filled out the forms, went through the process. They sent back a rejection letter. Not eligible for maternity leave due to part-time status. She sighed, rubbing her belly absent-mindedly. I was full-time before. But Keith cut my hours right after I announced my pregnancy. Evelyn's jaw clenched. It was a loophole, reducing an employee's hours before they could qualify for benefits. Did you appeal? Maria nodded. They said it was a scheduling adjustment. Nothing illegal. Just company needs. Of course they did. It was the kind of corporate maneuvering that buried people like Maria in bureaucratic dead ends. I've been saving, Maria continued. Once the baby's here, I'll take unpaid time off, then figure things out. Evelyn knew what figure things out meant. Maria would be forced to come back too soon, exhausted and vulnerable. If she couldn't keep up, she'd be replaced. That night, Evelyn lay awake in her cramped apartment, staring at the ceiling. The weight of what she had seen settled deep in her chest. She had built Novatech to create opportunity, to change lives. But somewhere along the way, her company had become like every other machine that chewed people up and spit them out when they were no longer convenient. She wouldn't stand for it. The next morning, Evelyn arrived early, positioning herself near Keith's office. The door was slightly ajar, and she could hear his voice, low and irritated. I don't care if she's pregnant. If she can't keep up, she's out. A pause. Then a sharp scoff. And no, we're not approving her leave. She'll quit before it gets that far. Evelyn's fingers curled into fists. She needed proof. For the next week, she documented everything. Every cruel remark, every unreasonable demand, every policy violation. She took notes, saved emails, even managed to record Keith berating another employee for requesting time off. The breaking point came on a Thursday afternoon. Maria had been working nonstop, her face pale, her hands shaking. She had barely eaten, barely sat down. When she finally stood to grab her things, she swayed. Then she collapsed. The office froze. For a second, no one moved. Then Evelyn was at her side. Maria. She shook her gently. No response. Panic rose in her chest. Keith stood a few feet away, watching with a look of irritation rather than concern. Someone call an ambulance, Evelyn snapped. She's fine, Keith said dismissively. She's just being dramatic. Evelyn turned on him, her voice cold. She just fainted. That's not drama. Keith rolled his eyes. She does this for attention. She's been slacking all week. A spark of fury ignited in Evelyn's chest. This wasn't incompetence. This was cruelty. She reached for her phone and dialed 911 herself. As she waited for the ambulance, Maria stirred slightly, her eyelids fluttering open. She tried to push herself up, but Evelyn held her steady. Don't move. Help is coming. Tears slipped down Maria's cheeks. I can't lose this job, she whispered. Evelyn squeezed her hand. You won't. When the paramedics arrived, Keith made a show of looking inconvenienced. As they loaded Maria onto a stretcher, he muttered under his breath, She's more trouble than she's worth. Evelyn turned slowly, fixing him with a stare that made him falter. For the first time in her life, she saw her company through the eyes of the people who worked for it. And she hated what she saw. Keith had no idea who she really was. But he was about to find out. The silence in the office was deafening after Maria was taken away. Employees who had witnessed the incident lowered their heads, pretending to work, but the tension in the air was undeniable. Keith scoffed, shaking his head as he adjusted his tie. Back to work, everyone, he muttered, striding past the cubicles. She'll be fine. Evelyn didn't move. Her blood simmered beneath her skin, every fiber of her being resisting the urge to rip into him right then and there. But she wasn't ready yet. Not until she had enough to ensure that when Keith fell, he wouldn't get back up. She spent the rest of the day compiling every piece of evidence she had collected. Keith's emails, records of his verbal abuse, testimonies from employees too afraid to report him directly. She had enough to not only fire him, but to expose just how deep the corruption had spread within Novatech's management. But Keith wasn't a fool. By the next morning, Evelyn sensed a shift. Eyes lingered on her longer than usual. Conversations quieted when she passed. Then, just before lunch, an email landed in her inbox. Eva Collins, report to HR immediately. Evelyn shut her laptop slowly, exhaling through her nose. The office was eerily quiet as she made her way to HR, where a tall, sharp-eyed woman sat waiting with a folder in front of her. Next to her, Keith reclined in his chair, arms crossed, a smug look plastered on his face. Evelyn took a seat. "Ms. Collins," the HR manager began, folding her hands. "There are concerns regarding inconsistencies in your employment records." Keith smirked. "Seems like you don't exist in our system, Eva." Evelyn kept her face neutral, though her pulse thrummed. He had been digging. "I don't know what you mean," she said evenly. Keith leaned forward, eyes gleaming. "Your employee ID doesn't match any previous records. Your background check? Incomplete. And when I looked into your supposed past employment, no one's heard of you." The HR manager cleared her throat. "We take hiring protocols seriously. Given these irregularities, we're placing you on immediate suspension while we conduct a full investigation." Keith's smirk widened. He thought he had won. Evelyn let the silence stretch, watching him. He was so confident, so assured of his power. She smiled. Then she reached into her bag and placed a thick envelope on the desk. "Actually," she said coolly, "I think it's time for my own investigation." Keith's smirk faltered. The HR manager hesitated before opening the envelope. Her face paled as she sifted through the documents. Emails, witness statements, audio recordings, proof of illegal scheduling practices, reports of harassment. Keith's fingers drummed against the desk. "Where did you?" Evelyn stood. "You've been underestimating me from the moment I walked through these doors," she said, locking eyes with him. "That was your first mistake." She reached up, pulling the glasses from her face. "Your second." Her voice turned razor-sharp. "Not recognizing your own CEO." The room went deathly silent. The HR manager gasped audibly, clutching the papers like they might catch fire. Keith, on the other hand, was frozen, his face draining of color so fast it was almost comical. Evelyn let the moment stretch, let the weight of her revelation sink into his bones. "I have everything I need," she continued, her voice steady. "Not just to fire you, Keith, but to make sure you never work in this industry again." He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. The arrogance, the cruelty, it all crumbled under the realization that the woman he had been condescending to, the one he had tried to ruin, held his career in her hands. Evelyn turned to the HR manager. "Prepare his termination papers. Effective immediately." The woman nodded quickly, already scrambling to comply. As Evelyn strode past Keith, she paused just long enough to murmur, "You should have been more careful." Then she walked out, leaving him sitting in his own downfall. News of Keith's firing spread through Novatech like wildfire. By the end of the day, hushed conversations turned into open discussions, and wary glances shifted into something Evelyn hadn't seen in a long time: hope. Employees who had spent years biting their tongues finally allowed themselves to wonder, if someone as untouchable as Keith could fall, what else could change? Evelyn wasted no time. She spent the next 24 hours dismantling the culture of fear Keith had built. Senior executives, who had turned a blind eye to his abuses, were summoned to emergency meetings. Some squirmed, others bluffed, but none had excuses strong enough to shield them from the consequences. Policies were overturned, wrongful terminations re-examined, and a new directive was issued. No more exploitation. No more silence. Asterisk, asterisk. By noon the next day, Evelyn was at the hospital. Maria lay in a dimly lit room, an IV drip attached to her arm. She looked fragile, but when she opened her eyes and saw Evelyn standing at her bedside, she managed a weak smile. "You're really the CEO," she murmured. Evelyn nodded, guilt tightening around her ribs. "I should have stepped in sooner." Maria exhaled softly. "You're here now." Evelyn reached into her bag, pulling out a folder. "This is for you." Maria frowned, hesitantly flipping through the papers. Her eyes widened. "This is a paid leave contract. You won't have to fight for unpaid time off," Evelyn said firmly. "Your job will be waiting for you when you're ready. And not the way it was before, fair hours, fair pay, and real support." Maria's breath hitched. "You don't have to." "Yes, I do." Evelyn's voice softened. "I saw what they did to you. To so many others. That ends today." Tears welled in Maria's eyes. But this time, they weren't from exhaustion or fear. "Thank you." Evelyn squeezed her hand. Just take care of yourself and that baby. When she returned to Novatech, a quiet transformation was already taking place. Employees no longer hunched over their desks in fear. Conversations were lighter, cautious, but hopeful. That afternoon, Evelyn gathered the staff in the largest conference room. Faces filled the space, some wary, some skeptical, all waiting. She stood at the front, no longer in disguise, but no longer the distant CEO hidden behind corporate layers either. For too long, she began, this company has allowed greed to outweigh humanity. That changes today. A ripple of uncertainty passed through the crowd. No one was used to hearing leadership speak this way. I went undercover because I didn't trust the reports I was being given. And what I found, she exhaled. It was worse than I imagined. She let her gaze sweep over them, ensuring they saw the sincerity in her eyes. But I also saw something else. People who work harder than they should have to. People who care about their jobs, about each other, even when the system tries to break them. She paused. That's not weakness. That's strength. And from this moment on, this company will honor that strength. Silence stretched through the room. Then, slowly, applause began to rise, hesitant at first, then building. It wasn't just approval. It was relief. Evelyn knew there was still work to do, that real change would take time. But for the first time in years, she felt something she hadn't in a long time. Pride. Not in the company she had built, but in the people who had kept it running despite everything. And this time, she wouldn't let them down.